Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening with the war in Iran, the potential peace deal, the possible reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and most importantly, what all of this means for the global economy. Because over the last 24 hours, Donald Trump has come out with one of his strongest statements yet, suggesting that some form of agreement with Iran may now be very close. Posting on Truth Social after speaking with leaders across the Middle East, Trump said, an agreement has been largely negotiated subject to finalisation between the United States of America, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the various other countries, adding that as part of the agreement the Strait of Hormuz will be opened, with the final aspects and details of the deal currently being discussed and expected to be announced shortly. So the message coming out from Donald Trump is very clear. He wants the world to believe that a breakthrough is very close, that the Strait of Hormuz could soon reopen, and that the conflict may be moving towards some form of resolution. But the problem is this: the messaging coming out of Iran is nowhere near as optimistic. Iranian officials are still saying that they will not compromise on their core demands, particularly around uranium enrichment and sovereign control. Iranian media has also pushed back against the suggestion that Hormuz is simply about to reopen on US terms. And Marco Rubio has also sounded far more cautious, saying that there's been progress, but stressing that significant issues still remain unresolved. So despite Donald Trump's bullish tone, this does not look like a completed peace deal. What it actually looks like is a possible framework for extending the ceasefire for another 60 days while negotiations continue on the really difficult issues. And those difficult issues are incredibly important because they go right to the heart of why this conflict started in the first place. The core issue remains Iran's nuclear program. The United States and Israel have repeatedly said that Iran cannot be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. Iran insists that its nuclear program is peaceful, but the concern from the West is that Iran has built up a very large stockpile of enriched uranium, and the level of enrichment has continued rising over the last few years. The United States reportedly wants Iran's enriched uranium either removed, dismantled, or placed under international control. Iran wants to retain its nuclear rights and maintain sovereign control over its program. And that's not some technical disagreement. That is the central issue in this entire crisis, because from the USA's point of view, if Iran keeps the ability to continue enriching uranium at high levels, then the threat has not really been removed, it's simply been delayed. But from Iran's point of view, giving up that capability entirely would effectively mean surrendering one of its most important strategic assets. So when people talk about a deal being close, we need to be very careful about what kind of deal we're actually talking about. A temporary reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is not the same thing as a permanent peace agreement. A 60-day extension to a ceasefire is not the same thing as resolving the nuclear issue once and for all. And a political announcement does not suddenly reverse all of the economic damage that's already been done, because even if this conflict did end tomorrow, the consequences are already feeding through into the global economy. Oil prices have now spent over 75 days above $90 per barrel, with long periods of that time being above $100 and actually above $110 on some of the days. And that matters enormously because energy shocks do not hit the global economy instantly. They spread slowly through every part of the system. It starts with oil and gasoline prices, then it feeds into shipping costs, transport costs, logistics costs, and manufacturing costs. Then it moves into food prices because fertilizer, refrigeration, packaging, and distribution all rely heavily on energy. Then it hits airlines, then supermarkets, then consumers, then company profits, and eventually it starts showing up in inflation figures, economic growth data, government borrowing, corporate earnings, and consumer spending. So even if politicians announce a deal tomorrow, that doesn't mean that the economic pain suddenly goes away. The damage has already been inflicted. And I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings in the market right now. There seems to be this hope that if a ceasefire is extended and the Strait of Hormuz reopens, then everything simply goes back to normal as if it never happened. But that's not how economics work. Companies have already paid significantly higher energy costs for months. Consumers have already been squeezed. Governments are already facing much higher borrowing costs. Central banks are already dealing with the risk of inflation staying higher for longer, and businesses all over the world are now having to make decisions in an environment of uncertainty and rising costs. Now that brings us to bond yields, because this is now becoming about much more than just oil prices. The yield on 30-year US government debt recently moved to its highest level since 2007, just before the global financial crisis. And that matters because bond yields effectively determine the cost of borrowing money. When yields rise, governments have to pay more interest on their debt. For countries already running large deficits and carrying enormous debt piles, that creates huge additional pressure. Every extra dollar spent on debt interest is money that can't be spent elsewhere. And this is not just a USA problem, this is affecting governments all over the world. Many countries borrowed heavily during the pandemic period. Many were already struggling with weak growth, aging populations, rising defence spending, and pressure on public finances. Now they're all dealing with higher energy prices and higher borrowing costs at exactly the same time. And that is a very dangerous combination. But it's not just governments that are being affected. Large corporations also borrow money through the bond markets. And as existing bonds mature, companies have to refinance them. If bond yields are significantly higher than they were a few years ago, which they are, then those companies now face much higher refinancing costs and also the cost of new bonds. That means lower profits, lower investment, more pressure on margins, potential job cuts, and potentially higher prices for consumers. So this crisis spreads through the entire economic system. It starts as a geopolitical conflict, then it becomes an energy shock, then an inflation problem, then a bond market problem, then a corporate earnings problem, then a consumer spending problem, and by the time all of that fully appears in the official economic data, the damage is already done. That's why I think we're far too early for people to declare that this crisis is over, because although the headlines may now be shifting from war towards diplomacy, the economic consequences are still building in the background. And there's another really important issue here as well. The United States has spent years trying to pressure Iran economically through sanctions. The US has targeted Iranian oil revenues, shipping networks, financial systems, and international transactions as part of what some commentators are now describing as an economic fury campaign. But there are now suggestions coming from former US officials that sanctions may have reached their maximum practical impact. And that raises a very uncomfortable question. If sanctions have already done as much damage as they realistically can, then what happens next? Does that push the United States towards some form of compromise? Does it push the situation closer towards military escalation? Or does it simply mean that neither side can achieve a decisive outcome? Because that's the real danger here. We may not be heading towards a clean resolution. We may instead be heading towards a prolonged period of instability, temporary pauses, fragile ceasefires, and ongoing economic disruption. And that kind of uncertainty is incredibly damaging for the global economy. Businesses can usually cope with short-term shocks, markets can cope with volatility, consumers can cope with temporary price spikes, but what economies struggle with is long-term uncertainty. If you own an airline, how do you plan when fuel prices remain unstable? If you're a manufacturer, how do you set prices when energy and raw material prices keep moving? And if you're a shipping company, how do you manage routes and contracts when one of the world's most important choke points may reopen temporarily but could close again at any time? And if you're a central bank, how do you cut interest rates while energy inflation remains elevated? And if you're a government, how do you support your economy when your own borrowing costs are rising sharply all the time? That's why the next few months are going to be so important, because we are now moving into the period where the real economic impact could start appearing in the numbers. In fact, it will. We're likely to see it in inflation data, we're likely to see it in trade figures, we're likely to see it in corporate earnings, we're likely to see it in government borrowing data, and we're likely to see it in consumer behaviour as households start cutting back spending under pressure from higher costs. So yes, a deal would clearly be positive. Yes, reopening the Strait of Hormuz would remove one of the biggest immediate risks facing the global economy. And yes, any move away from military conflict is obviously welcome. But we need to separate political headlines from economic reality, because a temporary ceasefire is not peace. A 60-day extension isn't long-term stability. And a political announcement is not the same thing as an economic recovery. The world has already absorbed a major shock, and the consequences of that shock are still spreading through the global economy right now. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments, but hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, or maybe you didn't like it but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.